Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to The Upside. I'm Jonathan Oleski with JMOR, and this is our virtual show brought to you by the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore and JMOR Magazine to keep Jewish Baltimore informed during this time of uncertainty. If you have questions for today's guests, please type them into the Zoom chat or message us at JMOR's Facebook page. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our two hosts, Beth Goldsmith, chair of the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore, and Dr. Scott Rifkin, publisher of JMOR. Beth and Scott, take it away.
Thanks, Jonathan, and welcome again to our audience. Today's show is designed to help us better understand how the Jewish community of today is changing and evolving. Of the close to 7 million Jews in the nation, there are an estimated 1 million that identify as a Jew of color, and that number is growing. Locally, according to our 2020 Baltimore community study, over 6% of our Baltimore Jewish community identifies as a Jew of color. Recognizing this, it is important that our community is inclusive and reflective of this ethnic and racial diversity. The Jews of Color Initiative, a California-based national organization, is committed to just this goal. Scott, please introduce our guest.
Thanks, Beth. Today, we're excited to welcome Ilana Kaufman, Executive Director of the Jews of Color Initiative, a nationally regarded thought leader. Ilana published articles in E-Jewish Philanthropy and the Foundation Review, among others, and plays a pivotal role in the movement to recognize Jews of color as equal members in the Jewish community. So let me start and kick off with, and thank you for being here so much. There you are. I was looking for where your picture was on my screen. Now we got it. That nice big file. Thank you. Thank you. And you do have to tell us about the pictures behind you before we finish up, please. I always hound Beth with this. I always want to know the pictures behind her. So tell us a little bit about Jews of color. Who are they? Where do they come from? How did they become Jews? Were they born Jewish? Did they convert? Tell me about the demographic and the reality behind a group of folks that we haven't paid a lot of attention to, and we should be.
Good morning or good afternoon to all of my friends in the Eastern Standard Time. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Jews of color historically have been in the United States since the 1600s. There's evidence of Jews of color moving primarily through the Caribbean into the South in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. And I've just actually come from doing some research about a woman named Sarah Moses, who was born in the late 1700s and came in from Barbados to New York City and was seen as an esteemed member of the Jewish community in New York City and identified as a Jewish person of color. And so historically, just like people of color in the United States, Jews of color have been part of the fabric of the United States really since the country's founding. Interestingly enough, as we sort of project to current times, we often think about the story of US Jews as fleeing pogroms and then of course the Holocaust. And so when we sort of narrow our perspective of history and think about the US Jewish experience through a lens of Eastern European migration and immigration to the United States, we sometimes forget that the landscape, the context in which Jews have always existed in the United States has always been multiracial. And so rather than wondering kind of where Jews of color come from, I want to gently invite us to sort of shift that question to wonder, how have we not understood ourselves in the Jewish community to be part of a national multiracial community that has really been kind of the history and demographic physics of the United States since its founding? Having said that, we know that very, very serious historical pushes have helped force Jews from places like Eastern Europe to spaces that are safe, protecting us from anti-Semitism, genocide, and ensuring the future of the Jewish people. That's why we think about the migration of US Jews largely from a lens of like the early 1930s and 1940s. And if we look at it through that picture, we have a sense that our narrative might have been simply expressed as European, Ashkenazi, and then by extension, white. I'll end by saying, like Beth did such a beautiful job in the framing, there are 7 million Jews in the United States, ages 0 to as old as we can grow ourselves. And in that demographic, the younger generations of Jews in the United States, every group that's born in the United States moving forward is more racially diverse than the group prior. And so what we know is at a minimum, there's about 1 million Jewish people of color, and every day Jewish babies are born, that group is more racially and ethnically diverse than the day prior. And so that gives us a little bit of a landscape of Jews of color in the United States. We have Jewish families of color that trace their Jewish history and ancestry 8 generations back. We have Jews of color who are multiracial like myself, who are born into Jewish contexts and Jewish families. We have Jews of color who are Jews by choice. We have Jews of color who have been adopted into US Jewish families. We have Jews of color who are Jewish adjacent to the multiracial Jewish life of our families. And so just like the rest of the Jewish community, Jews of color express in all of those pathways of connecting to Judaism and Jewish identity.
So 1 million out of 7 million is 14%. Okay. I got through math in about the 4th grade, and I stalled there, but that's about 14%. Why haven't we noticed Jews of color before?
I love that question. I mean, I think we haven't noticed Jews of color for a number of reasons. One is, if you look at very contemporary US history, if you look at textbooks, if you look at even the way we tell our own story in the US Jewish community, it has been rather narrow. And it's been rather narrow in terms of sort of situating itself within an Ashkenazi experience. We teach historically, because the Holocaust is so important, we kind of punctuate that point when we're thinking about teaching history to children in the United States, which gives them a very narrow understanding of the US Jewish experience. We have also in the US Jewish community, just like every other group in the United States, have been impacted by racism. And so those same sort of headwinds of racism that have told US Jews, particularly those who have self-identified as white, if you grew up in an environment that was geographically focused on just kind of white Jews, and I want to just be very, very careful. Up until the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, many Jews in the United States from Europe who have European background were not categorized as white. My mother's parents from Poland and Romania were not white when they arrived to the United States. They were an ethnic other. And the US has done a tremendous job of sort of stratifying people based on race and racism in the United States. And so even my use of language around whiteness needs to be qualified. But having said that, we have taught our US Jewish history through a very narrow lens to ensure that we never forget the Holocaust. And the cost of that is not understanding there's a larger context around it, including the history of Jews of all different backgrounds in the United States. I'll end by saying the impact of racism is great on all of us. People of color, white people, everybody is negatively impacted by racism in the United States. And one of the negative impacts of racism in the United States for the Jewish community is, one, we have been taught to be afraid of people of color in the US Jewish community, just the same way everybody in the United States is trained to be afraid of people of color. Number two, we have been taught that because we have largely presented Jewish communal leadership, Jewish communal organizational life and engagement as an experience that sometimes gets projected as pretty racially narrow, we have, I think, inadvertently sent a message to Jews of color that communal spaces are not for us, that communal spaces are not welcoming, and that communal spaces are not safe for people of color. Those of us who work in the Jewish community know that the Jewish community reaches far to create opportunities for engagement, meaningful participation, strong connection to Jewish life. But if racism is a headwind that affects all of the United States, we have to just assume in the most unheeded way that it affects the Jewish community too. And one of those impacts is keeping Jews of color away from Jewish communal organizations, particularly when we experience things like racism.
Is that sense of safety, which is necessary, is it getting better?
I love that question. I think it's getting better in a number of ways, Scott. Number one, I think there is a very sincere, honest, complex opportunity that I think many in the Jewish community are engaging in right now around just thinking about the impact of racism on the United States, on the Jewish community, and really understanding that as a nation, if we don't do some deep work around healing the racial divide, the US Jewish community too will be split, will be broken, and that's not good for us. Our people have survived more than 5,000 years by finding a way to be connected and strong. And so I think the spiritual awakening, sort of the consciousness awakening that community members are having is It's like a salve. It's like a strong message of calm and engagement and support in a context where, as Jews of color, as Black Jewish people, as brown Jewish people, however you identify, we have issues of a lack of safety, not only inside the community, but outside the community. So knowing that community members are engaged is a very, very reassuring dynamic, I think, for Jews of color. Number two, we see Jewish communal organizations taking a very serious look at what impacts and informs safety for Jews of color. Synagogue safety has to keep our Jewish people safe, has to keep all of us safe. But how do we do that in a way that gets away from racial profiling or sort of leaning on bias to inform who we invite into our synagogues or whom we invite out? How do we use skills of cultural communication and tools of diversity training to understand that when Jews of color are coming to synagogue, we're at risk of being profiled on our way to synagogue. We're at risk of being profiled on our way into synagogue. And time again, Jews of color have the experience of being inside synagogue, davening, using the facilities when somebody asks them a question that clearly suggests that they are assumed to not be part of the community. With more consciousness, with more education, preventing those kinds of situations happening is a definite way to keep community members feeling safe. And I would end by saying, seeing the larger Jewish community not only engage in Jewish communal life and solving the complexities of racism in the US Jewish community, but engage in the larger fabric of the US community. You know, we are in a country where by 2042, half of this country are going to be people of color. So it not only serves the Jewish community to know how to engage across the diversity of the US community, but to be in partnership with the diversity of the US Jewish community. And seeing our colleagues, our community members, our families, again, not only are something like 14% racially diverse, but 20 to 25% of US Jewish families self-identify as multiracial. So seeing our community more integrated, more connected, part of a larger fabric of kind of just the dynamic, diverse US Jewish life, it reassures Jews of color that we are part of a larger fabric, but it also replicates the context that we exist in every day, which is one that is multiracial, that's one that is engaged in responding to racism and racial injustice, and it's one that is involved deeply in engagement in our Jewish life.
So
I'm gonna jump in, Scott. You have to give me a turn here.
No,
Alana, first
please,
of
I'm
all,
sorry.
Alana, first of all, it's so wonderful to see you. You wouldn't remember, but I did get to meet you in person when we were still seeing people in person when you came to the Associated.
I love
and
it.
also
Thank
and
you.
also in some of the courses that I've been taking. I've been privileged to see you many times on Eli Talks and other things. So I sort of feel like I know you, but it's wonderful to have a conversation with you. Would you just back up a little bit for those people on our call, on our show, who may really be very, very fresh to all of this, and tell us sort of a definition, how people define what a Jew of color is, and maybe how you came to this work with the Jews of Color Coalition. Thanks.
Sure, I love that. Thank you, and it's great to see you again. I every time I talk about Baltimore, I live here in Berkeley, California. I was raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I've decided that Baltimore is like my sister city, and so it's great to virtually be back. Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Scott and Michelle and everyone. So let me just say this. First of all, race is a social construct. And we have to understand that that social construct has been designed in the US to create opportunities for stratification, in some ways really to rationalize genocide of our First Nation and our Indigenous people, to rationalize the enslavement of Africans, in the United States to rationalize indentured servitude for Irish, for other groups of people, to rationalize servitude for the Chinese who helped build our railroads. And so this is a structure and a system around race, racial identity, and racism that, at least for the purpose of this moment, I want us to kind of separate from people, right? Like, we are dealing with the physics of an institution as applied to humans, which makes it all so hard. And so in this country, while we on the one hand know race is a social construct, on the other hand, we know physics applied to race that result in racism are entirely real. And in the United States, sort of the general categories of people of color are Black and African American, Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, non-white, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native American, multiracial, First Nation. And so for the purpose of the Jews of Color Initiative, we use those general structures to inform who we identify and understand as a person of color. And, the identity of being Jewish and a person of color are interwoven and intermelded, just like if you have a gender identity and your identity is Jewish, ideally we get to live as whole people. And so I won't kind of separate out those identities. For the purpose of our work at the initiative, we continue to be loath to create a definition for who a Jewish person of color is. And in order to function and do our work, we need to have what we'll call a conceptual framework to inform the discussion. Because at the end of the day, it is so very, very important that people are allowed to racially self-identify and to recognize that race and racial identity are fluid sometimes. And so in one environment, and I'll just offer, and I'll take a risk with this group, for example, in one environment, those who self-identify as white and Jewish, if you're among people of color, that privilege with whiteness is very, very clear. But if you're with white supremacists, the absence of privilege and being targeted for not being that kind of white is also very clear. And so the privileges that come with race can be conditional upon context. And that's also true for people of color. And so for the purpose of our work, you have the general racial definitions of the United States, in our case as informed by the US Census, because we try to align our data and our categories into parallel structures for the purpose of research, for example. And then in the US Jewish community, we also understand that there are nuances. And in some of those nuances look like those who identify as Latinx or Latine, and they might identify as people of color in some contexts, but in other contexts, they might identify as more white. We also think about our Sephardi and Mizrahi family, and we understand that for the most part in the United States, and we are in deep conversation with our colleagues all of the time about this, for the most part for our Sephardi family, they do not self-identify as people of color here in the US. For our Mizrahi family, that is not true. And so for Mizrahi family, for some very much self-identify as people of color, are seen as people of color, and others do not. And so we have those general categories that I talked about, and then there are the shades of nuance and gray, which are just very important because on the one hand, the US Jewish community has to understand the context in which we exist, and on the other hand, our story is not the same. And so we have nuance, we have racial nuance, we have ethnic nuance, and to sort of live our fullest selves as the Jewish people, diverse in all of the ways, we need to make room for the experience of a range of ethnic experiences across the US Jewish community, racial experiences, and do that in a way that keeps our kind of container of US Jewish life intact. And the US, and having said that, the Jews of Color Initiative, we were founded about 3 years ago. We have just three things that we do, and we try to do them well. We run the nation's only philanthropic fund focused on Jewish people of color, and we focus on field building. And so we focus on things like leadership development, the establishment of best practices and policies. We try to reinforce racial identity for Jewish community of color so that there's a strong identity out there and people feel proud to be part of the US Jewish community. We focus on things like research. And we have what I think is a privilege of listening to the questions everybody has out there, and then we get to commission the research to answer those questions. So we do the funding, we do research for the national Jewish community, and then the third thing we do is education. We don't do diversity training, we're terrible at that. Our focus is really on talking about things like demographics, data, and the paradigms in which we exist, and working with leaders to really grapple with what does it mean to sort of realize what I think is our promise and the power and potential of our US Jewish community by grappling with themes like racism, Jewish identity, and the US Jewish community.
So Ilana, let me get back to something that was helpful. Let me get back to something you said earlier and try to make a corollary to see whether we have the same issue. Throughout the South and to some extent throughout the North, all through our nation's history, the evangelical churches, the Protestant churches created structures within their churches and within their relationships with God that justified slavery and then Jim Crow eventually. You know, the whole idea of the personal relationship with God as opposed to a morality responsibility was a huge conditional response to how do we justify slavery? How do we justify Jim Crow?
Right.
And it created this institutional racism within that religious community that today has led to separate churches, a separate, a religious world for folks of color and folks of, folks who identify as white. In the Jewish community, do we have the same issues? Have we created some of those strange structures that we need to break down?
What an interesting question. I'll start with a quick anecdote. I was teaching at a synagogue in New York City last year, and we were talking about these themes of racial and ethnic diversity in the US Jewish community, and sort of when do we see the divisions, to your question, Scott, and where are the opportunities for responding to that? And I had a gentleman come see me after the conversation and the talk, and he said to me, I have belonged to the same synagogue all of my life in New York City. Every sort of day when our minions meet in the morning, after we finish up, the Sephardic minion comes in and then they daven. And we barely say hello to one another. We don't know each other. We don't ever talk to each other. And it has never occurred to me why, if we are in the same community, we would even let ourselves pass by one another without acknowledging one another. And so what has happened in our community where we have created so much distance across ethnic expressions of Jewish life, denominational expressions of Jewish life, where how race imprints on top of those dynamics, that our community will literally pass by each other in a context where we are only 2% of the US population. And so we should feel entirely compelled and motivated to get to know one another, to be curious about each other, and more importantly, be in connection with each other. But we have reinforced the expectation that we are separate. And so just to extend on your analogy a little bit, I think that and I know from talking with our colleagues, with funders, with institutional leaders, we have created a structure where we operate within an understanding of shared values. And I'm going to put that in air quotes for the purpose of this conversation. But when you really interrogate shared values in the US Jewish community, one that is predominated, and again, I don't say this with any heat, but is predominated in terms of leadership, funding structures, how resources flow, predominates to support, or at least has been applied to organizations, leaders, and efforts almost exclusively led by white colleagues out there. When you have that dynamic, when we create opportunities that are values-based, based on repairing and mending our world, based on God seeing and valuing each one of us as the same, the value of never assuming who is in front of us, because it might be somebody who is holy, it might be God themselves. When those are our core values, but our community is so divided, we have to understand that institutional headwinds have created structures of division that have been so compelling that they have disconnected and disaggregated us. Those institutional pressures are based on things like class, like race, like if your family came from Western Europe or Eastern Europe in the US Jewish community. I live in the Bay Area. I was bat mitzvahed at a synagogue, one of the oldest synagogues in San Francisco, that was founded 2 years apart from the other biggest, oldest synagogue in San Francisco, because one served German Jews and one served Eastern European Jews. And so we have not only adopted these behaviors, these beliefs, and these values, but we have perpetuated them. And I want to end by saying, one of the reasons we have done this, or let me back out, we haven't done this to be intentionally racist or intentionally create separation. One of the reasons we've done this, and if you study the history of modern Judaism in the US, the establishment of the Reform movement, for example, the architecture of modern synagogues, and when I say modern, I mean 1800s forward in the United States, what you've seen as an adoption is an adoption of the values of assimilation. The Reform movement, if you look at the history of architecture, created synagogues to mirror churches so that people would leave us alone and we could eschew anti-Semitism by mimicking and mocking, in some ways, the establishment of a church structure in our own contexts. And we have perpetuated those actual tools of separating our buildings, of separating our people, of stratifying and placing value on which expression of Jewish life is more important or more valuable than the other expressions of Jewish life. And so I think the example you bring up is not only excellent, I think you can see clear examples of it in the history of modern US Judaism.
I'm going to jump back in. Thank you. Wow. Um, I was going to just ask a question about what synagogues and organizations can do, but truthfully, I think we can probably figure out ways to continue to educate. So my question is going to be one that you would answer and I wouldn't be able to, which is, according to the Jews of color that I have had the opportunity to speak with and interact with, whether intentional or microaggression, things that no one meant to offend, we have turned off this group. We have, not been seen as welcoming. How do we get Jews of color in our community to give us another chance and come back?
I love that question, Beth. Thank you. I mean, first of all, I want to invite everyone who is listening or viewing this conversation, if you haven't yet just kind of accepted that, of course, we are all racist because we are part of the United States structured fabric. And I know it's uncomfortable. I know it's so uncomfortable, but even if you read Professor Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and if you don't have time to read that, listen to the podcast with Professor Kendi and Brene Brown. It's fabulous. But even Dr. Kendi will talk about his own raising, the way he was raised, and the fact that he too developed racist perspectives and racist ideas in the United States. So first of all, racism transcends racial boundaries, and it imprints on all of us. And so if we become less excited about being called racists or self-identifying as racist and actually move to a place that says, of course we are. Like, how could we ever move through the United States when it's the air that we breathe, it's the rain that falls on us? So let's not be hard on ourselves about being racist. Let's be hard on ourselves by not reacting and responding when we know we are racist. And so first I want to invite people to bring down the heat a little bit and to just kind of come to terms with the fact that we are all in this together, and darn it if this country hasn't dealt with its racism. After we do that, I think the next thing to do is to engage in some kind of learning and to create opportunities to explore and reflect on the ways each one of us creates headwinds, distance, pushes people away from the Jewish community. It might be in assumptions that we make. It might be in how we conduct ourselves. I have been to board meetings as a community leader and a community professional where I have been greeted with colloquial terms specific to African Americans, or even a fist bump instead of receiving a proper greeting based on how the person was reading me and experiencing me. And if anybody's worked with me or knows me, it's probably not the best greeting for me. And so, we also have to understand that we act in ways that push people away, and we need to be open to feedback about that. Again, not getting excited about being called out on our behavior, being excited about being called in. Because if somebody tells you you've done something that offended them, they love you enough, they care about you enough to let you know. If you don't find out, it means they didn't care about you or that relationship enough to bring you in. And so it's an invitation and a privilege when somebody lets you know you've offended them. And then the next thing I want to say is, I know it's tough, but like, try it out. And then the last thing I want to say is, when we create inclusive opportunities, we partner, first of all, with our bridges. There are lots of Jews of color in the US Jewish community who want to be in partnership with you, who want to help you strategize, to problem solve, and literally to help be the bridge until we make more movement in this community. And so partner with those people, leverage those people. Next, empower Jews of color to participate, to have influence and input, to take responsibility for our own projects, invite us into bigger opportunities. When I was in Baltimore just over a year ago, I had an opportunity to meet with 20 Jews of color in advance of one of our conversations that we had at one of the synagogues in Baltimore. In that conversation with 20 Jews of color, I met a single individual who now has partnered with a number of community entities in Baltimore to bring the national US community a Shabbaton for Jews of color and multiracial Jewish families in May. Over the arc of 1 year, you move from opportunities to create inclusive experiences with people who are bridges. You have opportunities to provide funding, resources, and empower people, let people feel confident about their ideas, provide the resources to do it, and then leaders emerge. And so in this case, Dr. Harriet Wims will be part of an effort to host more than 300 people. We have the privilege of helping fund this program and this event. And again, this comes from creating opportunities for inclusive engagement, working with your bridges, providing resources, and providing encouragement and engagement opportunities. And just that breaks it down. And next thing you know, you have 300 people centered in Baltimore, born in Baltimore, but a national Shabbaton that will be happening this May in 2021. So there's an arc of an example.
Thanks so much.
So how do folks, and I've got a lot, I could ask you a thousand questions. I really could. Beth knows I could, so she's praying that I'll not go crazy here. But you mentioned this event. Talk a little bit about how people find out about it and reach out and try to participate.
This event, so Dr. Harriet Wims has been working with a number of colleagues out there. I also want to give a shout out to Rabbi Jesse Dresden from Repair the World. And with that partnership, in May, there will be a Shabbaton weekend hosted by a number of community organizations. There will be opportunities for all kinds of spiritual life. You have like a whole scores and scores of community leaders of color participating as clergy, as planners, as strategists. It's a traditional Shabbaton, however, on Zoom. So there'll be opportunities for community activities and programming. The Jews of Color Initiative will be pushing out information as soon as it's available. People will be able to sign up. There will be swag and amazing tools and materials and supplies mailed to everyone's home so that you can participate. We will be pushing out the information. We believe the first communications will be available in March, and the entire nation is invited to participate. And so we're very, very excited about the leadership of Dr. Harriet Wims in this community Shabbaton.
Can we talk for a moment about racism itself? Okay.
Sure.
And you mentioned something that's really very true, that it's an inherent part of human beings to be racist and to accept that.
Right.
Do we have a bit of self-denial in the Jewish community? What I hear in the Jewish community often is, we're liberals, we're Democrats, we're not racists. But yet I go on a trip with a group of Jewish folks to Israel, and I hear racial epithets for a week and a half.
Right.
How much self-denial is there, and what do we do about it?
It might be self-denial, Scott. I think we can also expand that and understand that for US Jews, particularly to your point, those who have understood our history to be one of social justice values, who have understood part of the US Jewish experience to be one of social activism and social engagement. For people who have also been, and I'm going to use this word in a very focused and pointed way right now, hunted historically, whether it be the Holocaust, whether it be Charlottesville in 2016. Some of it might be self-denial, but some of it is also a consciousness about being racist in a concept, in a construct, and in a context where that racism is different than white supremacy. White Jews still have the capacity to be white supremacists, but they are not the same. And when in the US, you have been targeted for anti-Semitism, when synagogues have been attacked, when community members have been murdered, when you are one of the highest numbers of people who are victims of crimes through the ADL, understanding the data, it's very, very hard to discern whether or not you're in self-denial, or if you cannot imagine being racist or white supremacist like the people in Charlottesville. And I think we are in a social, cultural, political context where white supremacy has emerged in such a pointed and significant way, in such a repugnant way, that it can make some folks who are white particularly those who see themselves as champions of social justice values, it can feel hard to overlay a concept like racism, particularly in a context where white supremacy and white nationalism are so very real. Having said that, you know, I was raised in the Reform community, and I believe that if Jewish values were enough, if just Jewish values were enough to give us defense against racism, then our communities would already look very different. And so while on the one hand, Jews who are white very often can never self-identify with the kinds of racist or white supremacists that we think about in terms of Charlottesville, for example. On the other hand, we have to appreciate that we still have so much separation in our community racially. We have a total absence, or almost an entire absence, of Jewish leaders of color in senior leadership roles in the community. We have almost an entire absence of senior leaders or Jewish people of color in our philanthropic environments. We have almost a total absence of Jews of color in leadership roles. Racism must be playing out. And again, like I said earlier with Beth's question, if we can get more comfortable with understanding that racism affects everyone, of course it's playing out in our communities. And therefore, let's just move on and get curious about how that would be part of the antidote around that dynamic.
So let's talk about the antidote. I grew up like you did in a Reform synagogue. And it was a Reform synagogue that prided itself on being very open and having a big tent. And there were Jews of color there, but they weren't 14%. That maybe I missed it.
Right.
Maybe I was oblivious. But my suspicion is it wasn't 14%. And you would think in a Reform synagogue, it ought to be higher than 14%.
Right.
When you think about it, because maybe the Reform synagogues, in theory, would be more inviting. So the question is, where are those folks and why aren't they in those synagogues? And if so, what do we need to do to make folks feel comfortable becoming, what you don't want to end up with is two separate religions.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Well, first I want, let's appreciate that of the 14% of Jews of color, we're not equally distributed across the country. And so not every region can or should or will be able to aspire toward 14% of their community being racially diverse. In the same way that every community cannot assume that because there are 20% multiracial Jewish families in the United States, that can be the population in their environment. But let's set that as a goal, right? Like, let's aspire a little bit. And if you're on the coasts, 25% of US Jewish families self-identify as multiracial. And so it should really give you a strong sense of where some opportunities are and also where we could be looking for role models out there and people who might be leading this work. And so a couple of things. One is, we know from looking at the data that even in communities, and I grew up in San Francisco, I believe I've counted, and there were 5 non-white Jewish people of color in our community of 2,000. I grew up, that synagogue was situated in the western addition of San Francisco, and just by way of context, a predominantly African-American and Japanese-American community. And what I can tell you is, if a Jewish community organization is not built on shared perspectives and shared values, and what that means is who's in your community right now, more importantly, who's going to be in your community 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 and 20 years from now. And if we aren't having these constructive conversations about what's the mission of our organization, whom should we serve, and more importantly, how should we serve them? Who should we be reaching out to in terms of target populations? Who should get disproportionate resources in our community because they have been underserved historically? If we're not having those conversations with a diverse group of Jewish people, we will err on the side of just having too narrow of perspectives. And I think that's part of the physics of the current dynamic is you have this very diverse community out there, but our leadership continues to be very, very narrow in perspectives and experiences. And it's really, really important to bridge that gap. And that's one of the reasons why we invest in leadership. The other things we need to do are to have a very serious conversation about just how has racism informed and affected our communities. telling a brief story. If any of you have read the book Black Power, Jewish Politics by Mark Dollinger, there's an excerpt in there talking about the movement to free and liberate Soviet Jews, and how the structure of that movement was based on the Black Power movement. So I grew up in a context where I was part of the group of teenagers who were taken to the San Francisco Soviet consulate to free Soviet Jews. The Soviet consulate is in a predominantly Black neighborhood, or on the edge of a Black neighborhood in San Francisco. So as an adult reading this section of the book, the feeling that came over me, Scott, was one of betrayal. And as I read the chapter of that book, I felt hurt that here I was, a Black Jewish person, raised in a Black neighborhood where our synagogue existed, taken to go free Soviet Jews using the tools of the Black Power movement. But I was never told that was my history. I was never told that was my history. And what an empowering, incredible learning that would have been for 13-year-old me. And what an integrating experience that would have been for 13-year-old me. In looking,
People that were teaching you that history know it was the history?
Pardon me?
Did the folks who were teaching you even understand that that was the
Okay,
history?
so that's exactly. And so my last point would be, but as an adult and as a historian and a scholar and all of the things, I can look back and I can know that there was no adult in that synagogue that had the capacity to understand the history, to analyze it through a racially equitable and just lens, to juxtapose the information that we were being informed, we were using to inform our work, and then to sort of look across the diversity of the students in the class and go, oh, this would be a really important lesson to teach the whole group of students. And so there was nobody in that space aware of, pedagogically trained to, content-wise trained to even understand what was happening, identify, and then turn it into some sort of teaching moment, which makes me go back to this point of shared values. Again, if we don't have diverse people informing the container in which we do our work, we know that that work will be narrow. We just know that. And that was a case of the work just being very, very narrow. Let me just end by saying, I had an opportunity to teach a group of rabbis 2 weeks ago, and the senior rabbi who bat mitzvahed me was in that conversation, and I was able to share a little bit of this story and this experience. And so it's important to also know that like the timeline doesn't end and the opportunities don't stop to share information, to teach about history, and to sort of bring it all back together for the good of the community. There was an opportunity to close that loop, and that felt really wonderful.
I'm jumping back in. I mean, as Scott said, we could talk to you all day, and you've mentioned a number of books, and because we can't keep you always to talk to, would you perhaps want to share a few other titles, and we will make sure that they appear on our websites, things
Sure.
for people in our audience that, would help with their coming on board with all of this.
Great. Well, first, I would invite everybody to critically read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Professor Ibram Kendi. And again, if you don't want to read the whole book, I would really just invite you, and I would even come back and we could talk about it, but listen to the podcast with Brene Brown and Dr. Kendi. It's just beautiful. It's accessible. And it's I think it's healing in some ways. If you want to look at the history of Black-Jewish relations in the United States and get a very critical analysis of it, please read Black Power, Jewish Politics by Mark Dollinger. And it will, I think, open up and wake up all of our conversations about how we think we understood what happened in the 60s and in the civil rights and then the post-civil rights era in the United States. I want to encourage you to read the media outlet Hey Alma. Hey Alma. And there are just so many diverse voices that come through that media outlet, as like it would be a traditional newspaper if we still had traditional newspapers in that way. But Hey Alma is quite wonderful. The other thing I want to say is, and I can help make this happen, but we have a number of studies on our website. I want to encourage you all to, if you're interested in data and research, please invite me to dip your head in the research and data. And so we can provide you some links and some resources for that. In addition to our own research, there's another study with Atlantic 57 that confirms this number of 14% that Scott's been talking about. So we have a number of tools for that. And then let me just end, by saying, and in about 6 months, as we head toward the Chagim, we will be releasing our next study. And this study will talk about, now that we have a sense of how many Jews of color there are in the United States, what have our experiences been like? What do we need to know about what it's like to traverse our world of the US Jewish community through the lens of being a person of color? And we're going to look at it through age and stage, if you've been involved in Jewish community life, formal or informal. And so the last thing I want to say is please stay tuned, because we will be delivering that data to all of you. It is our great privilege to do that, and we'll be rolling that out in September.
Are the Jewish museums around the country receptive?
Yeah, no, what a cool question. Yes. And so what I want to say is, and this connects to a question you've asked, Scott, and that Beth asked, when people get awakened to the reality of just grappling with race and racism, that this is our collective work to do. And what it means if we do this well is the US Jewish community will be stronger, will be tighter, will be bigger. People respond with enthusiasm. And so museums have been responsive, looking at both their collections and who are on the groups and committees that inform collections. You know who else has been really responsive? The American Jewish Historical Society. And so if you kind of think about these spaces that archive and curate who we are and how we tell our story, there's been total enthusiasm. Let me just offer just a quick little story. When I was at the American Jewish Historical Society speaking, I met with Annie Paulin, who helps run the society. And I said to her, do you have any Jews of color in the archives? And she was like, I don't know, let's go look. I'm thinking she's going downstairs into some dungeon of some kind, looking up old files. She just looked up something in the computer. But at that time, she said, I don't think we do. Fast forward 1 year, there were there was an entire family of Jews of color in the archives. The Moses family, whom I mentioned earlier, was Sarah Moses, her brother, Isaac Moses. And so when we ask the question, suddenly we even go back to our own resources and find new answers. And so not only have museums been responsive, but this historical society, and there's an opportunity to kind of retell our story in a more expansive way. And I think people are very excited to do that.
Yeah, I'm imagining back to that feeling of hurt you had when you discovered that your history had been ignored.
Right.
Of walking through a Jewish historical museum and making sure that history is there as well.
Absolutely. And I will tell you, when I saw the first image of Sarah Moses, it was the most historical image of a US Jew I had ever seen. I was moved by it. I don't think I became, I'd be overstating it to say I had become obsessed, but I really, really felt affirmed and validated seeing this tiny ivory portrait of Sarah Moses, beautifully, beautifully treated in this portrait. Also, her skin was lightened and the aesthetic was lightened, reflecting the racism of the time in art. And so it's an extraordinary piece. And when we tell the complexity of our story, not only that Sarah Moses existed, but then the treatment of her artistically, what an exciting thing for us all to study as Jews, as US citizens, as part of this community. And so, yeah, not only is it validating, but these are exactly the things we should be grappling with as community members.
So we're running towards the end of the show. Yeah. You're a phenomenal guest. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott.
Spend a moment talking about how folks reach out to you and to your work and the website address and all that sort of thing. And then I'm going to turn it over to Beth, who may have some final questions and then some closings for the show.
Okay. Please visit us at jewsofcolorinitiative.org, jewsofcolorinitiative.org. We have a Facebook page, Jews of Color Initiative, with maybe 1,500 community members on there. Please sign up for Galim. Our newsletter comes out about every 6 weeks, and we introduce to you members of our community leaders, the new grants we've made. And so if you want to see the expansiveness of our community, please sign up for our newsletter. You can find our email addresses and all the things on the website. And the other thing I want to say is go on our website and also go meet more community members. And so look at our grantees and then Google them and then join their newsletters and get on their information pages. And so beyond the Jews of Color initiative, go find out about all the other colleagues we get to work with and let them be part of your community too.
So we get with a couple of thousand people that watch this, whether it's on Facebook or whatever. You've educated people phenomenally today. So thank you.
Oh,
It's
thank
really
you.
very, very helpful. Beth, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Scott. And thank you so much for being here with us, Ilana. I can only second every emotion that Scott is sending. Education is the most important piece. And we are, unfortunately, not able, now that we're getting, sort of our consciousness raised and aware, we're still shut in. And so we're not having that benefit. Dr. Harriet Wims is a member of Hisakamuna, my congregation, a conservative congregation here. I do not know from my work with some of the other Jews of color who are active in our community that there are a number of students at Krieger Schechter Day School. I believe there are 11 students there. So we all have touch points. We have ways of seeing this and having our consciousness raised. And it just seems to me that that's the key.
Right.
I do believe, Scott, as you said, and as certainly Ilana said, with whatever our guilt may be, that Jewish values and by and large, this Baltimore community wants to be inclusive and needs to know more in order to do that job and to do it the best way we can. So thank you again so much for being here. And I want to tell everyone who's watching that next week, Scott and I are taking a break. We're taking off for a week, and we'll be returning on Tuesday, January 5th. For another great conversation. It's going to be a tough act to follow. I know whoever's going to be following, Ilana, and I hope you will promise to come back to us again. So maybe when the new study is done and we'll be able to update everyone, that would be great. So in the meantime, everyone who's watching, please visit associated.org and jmoreliving.com for more information, stories, and resources, and sign up for the weekly newsletter. And please, as we say goodbye for 2020, I know not too many people are sorry to see it go. I want to wish everyone a very happy and most important, healthy new year. We'll see you in 2021. Stay well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.